Greetings all and welcome to the next exciting installment of Chieftain Q&A. When I actually have the time, I go back over the appropriate thread on Patreon to look at the questions which have been asked of me, and I attempt to answer them as best I can. It's been a while, it's been an interesting few months since the last one. Squadron Command is taking up a lot of my time. On the other hand, the emotional support missiles have by now reached their destinations. I hope you are satisfied with the level of emotional support being obtained from them. I am kicking around the idea of a full-sized variant. There have been requests. On the other hand, I suspect they're not going to be cheap. On the other hand, I may also reissue the smaller ones as well, just in case you have realized that you have missed out on an absolutely amazing opportunity and you want to catch up. In the meantime, let's see the travels of your received missiles, and I'll put up a bit of a slideshow at some point. Put it, let's say Facebook, X, whatever. Tag me whatever way you want to get them. I think I even have an email address. In the meantime, I am going to open up the t-shirts for reissuing. I'm expecting to be at a couple of events over the summer, so it's a good way for me to track you down if you can't find the 2-meter tall guy with the calf hat. So where I'm going to be, it's going to be, we have Ways Fest, I'm looking at going to Oz Armour. In fact, I am going to Oz Armour because I spent the money on the tickets, so it'll be rather an expensive issue if I don't go. Might be one or two other places as well, but anyway. On with the questions. And White Sagittarius starts us off by bringing up the MTLS-1G14 and wonders what might have been a better alternative, and would that have had an effect on the general outcome of battles? The answer is a resounding no, at least in my opinion anyway, not least because a lot of the tanks were never delivered to not be effective in the first place. For those who are not familiar with this tank, in the US archives it is referred to as the 4-man Dutch tank, which of course distinguishes it from the 3-man Dutch tank, neither of which were Dutch. Both being manufactured by Marmon Harrington in Indianapolis. Now, I spent 30 minutes going over the test reports in an earlier video. Anything would have been a better alternative, probably including nothing and simply using the crew as infantry. However, of course, there are caveats and catches. The first is that the Dutch didn't have a hell of a lot of choice in the matter. The Marmon Harrington was not the first go-to, but since everybody else was too busy building tanks for their own use, or at least the Commonwealth's use, or too busy being occupied by the Germans, what choice had they? The one exception was the US, which did seem to have some capacity to spare, albeit the British were looking to skim off of that. So if the Dutch wanted tanks, they had to go to a niche manufacturer to get them. And to be fair, these were not the first tracked armoured vehicles which Marmon Harrington had made, so deciding to go with them was not entirely off the rails. So there really were not very many other options to pick from anyway, so in that case the only remaining question really is, should they have bought a different Marmon Harrington vehicle? And very arguably, they may have done better going with the CTLS-4TAC, known in US service as the Light Tank T16. At least that was considered good enough to put into some form of American service. Now, of course, it wasn't as theoretically capable as the two bigger tanks, but at least it wasn't too heavy and it seemed vaguely likely to be able to get from A to B without breaking down too dramatically. You would show up with nothing more than machine guns instead of the 37mm cannon, but better than machine guns than nothing, and the 37mm wasn't exactly something to write home about anyway. The only other possible advantage would have been that the lighter tank might perhaps have made it to the battlefield before the battle. Most of the Marmon Harringtons ordered were never delivered to the Dutch East Indies because they were too busy being occupied by the Japanese to accept them. Now, whether or not the presence of the 4TACs, let's say they didn't go to US Army service instead of the 1G14s or 1TBIs would have made any practical difference to the outcome of the battle is also highly questionable. I suspect the Japanese would have overrun the place fairly handily either way. Bradley Fox, was the ammunition used by the M36 TD regular AP or HVAP? Mainly AP. Not least because they didn't need much more. The T-33 was capable of punching through the frontal plate of a Panther at 1100 yards from the M36's gun. Now, if you fire the same projectile from the longer barreled T-15E1, which was either an experimental towed AT gun or you found it on the T-26E4s. If you're curious about it, of course, because it wasn't fielded en masse. It was rated to do the job at 2,300 yards. Now that, of course, did not stop testing of the T-30 series of projectiles, and they came out with a slew of designs with various different core weights and dimensions. Things did not go all that well. Initial versions were failing to completely penetrate Panther at 300 yards in tests in October of '44. You were better off firing regular shot. By February of 1945, they had reached the E15 variant and were getting better results, but it was the T-30E16 which struck the jackpot. If you could see a Panther, you could likely kill it. You had a damn good chance of killing a King Tiger at range also. But by this point, there was almost nothing left on the German side to shoot at with it. Bring on the IS-3s. Freedom delivery. What is my wish list of SIGINT ELINT capability which I might consider the most impactful to my maneuver elements? Would I want anything organic to the tank battalions, or would I prefer them as division or brigade assets? Interesting question. Obviously, the correct answer is all of the ELINTs all of the time. But there are practical issues. I'm not convinced it's something which really should be at the line battalion level. I mean, what are you going to do with the information in practical terms? However, in the Cav squadrons, which are supposedly out further front, I'd say it's pretty much mandatory to have such equipment for several reasons. The obvious one these days is you want all the help you can to get early warning of drones. Most are, after all, not fiber optic cables. Another is that out front, you are going to have more chance of picking up things like drone control stations, counter-battery radars, even observation posts calling in contact reports, and you will also still have sufficient space and time to actually do something with the information. However, those are also things which in theory can be just as automated as well. So let's say you fly a sniffer drone around, maybe on a pre-programmed course. It automatically transmits the information back. I'm sure we'll get there. We do have manpacks right now, the TLS, so making an airborne variant, which perhaps need not get into SHORAD range, seems theoretically sensible. Then the problem is going to be processing all that data to garner useful intelligence, and I don't think that's something which can be done at battalion level, especially given that we're trying to reduce the sizes of battalion command posts. Now, to a point, this question is actually currently being tackled by the multifunction reconnaissance companies and some IBCTs, which I'm not going to really get into too much myself as I'm not entirely convinced by the things. But they do have an EW/ELINT platoon to make the most of those sorts of detections. Now, exactly the level of capability these units can provide, not only in terms of raw signal gathering, but processing of that signal data into useful information, is something that the Army still seems to be rather cagey about, or just hasn't answered it yet. I am open to be convinced that it is a more capable unit than I think, but at the line unit level, I firmly believe in the principle of keeping things as simple as possible. Now, that doesn't mean not having advanced capabilities, but it does require great automation so that decisions being made are relatively simple. Alexander H. What do I think of the Shakal variant of the Boxer with the Puma turret and space for 6 dismounts, and the future wheel-based Panzer Grenadiers of the new medium forces of the German Bundeswehr, something similar to the Stryker infantry? I'm not convinced by the medium weight brigade idea. The whole thing about the Strykers is that they were supposed to be rapidly deployable by air, given that almost anywhere the US is going to fight is going to be across an ocean from most of the US's bases. Boxer is freaking huge. You are not going to get that into a C-130 or easily into A400s. In fact, you need to split up the chassis and mission module, so you need 3 aircraft to lift 2 vehicles. With 53 A400s in the fleet, Germany can't even lift a full battalion's worth at a time. Now, to be fair, it takes pretty much the entire US Air Force heavy lift fleet to get a Stryker IBCT around, which is probably one reason it's never been done. But still, at least the US could do it if it wanted to. Instead, the wheels are for driving around quickly, maybe getting around Europe. The idea of getting a capable force somewhere faster to hold the line is reasonable until the heavy forces show up to do the real fighting, if you have a sufficiently large heavy force to bring up and make it worthwhile. but I don't think the Bundeswehr has that much manpower and equipment power to make that split worthwhile. And just how much time are you going to save in practical terms between driving on wheels to the NATO border versus tracks? I mean, it's something I learned as I progressed up. It's, at higher levels like division or corps levels, an hour or two usually doesn't make a hell of a lot of difference. If it's obvious to me, it must be obvious to the Germans, so they obviously have a rationale which makes it worthwhile. At least a publicly stated rationale that they say makes it worthwhile. Whether or not they believe it, I don't know, but that's budget issues, I guess, maybe. As for the vehicle itself, I and my emotional support missile had the opportunity to climb inside it at DSEI last year. The thing is freaking huge. I may have mentioned that. It sounds like the same thing mentioned earlier, but I repeat it for emphasis. I understand why. Underfloor and blast protection is the fashion of the generation and de rigueur. But the vehicles are still massive. Have you seen the Australian Recce variant? Daimler Dingo and Ferret crewmen are probably turning in their graves. Anyway, I was wandering around the show at Perun, and the first thing I said to him was, how the hell are you supposed to get out of this thing quickly without falling down? Imagine you're in the middle of battle, ramp drops, and everybody races out wearing their kit. I don't know. And that's also a long way down if you miss a step and you hurry. And it's also a long way back up. Pulling a casualty up the ramp on a Bradley or M113, as we have seen done in Ukraine, is a piece of cake. Even the Patria AMV I crawled around at Finnish brutality the other year, they managed to keep a reasonable ramp. Plus, of course, those steps murder the space one may want to sleep on. Now, I've no concerns about the remote weapon station. I played a bit on a Puma simulator at Gamescom last year. The Bundeswehr had a big stand for recruiting. The FCS and its various programmable tricks are fine. I was also surprised to note actually when I was in the Shakal a manual backup from the gunner's seat, so it actually can be done. If you really want a big wheeled IFV with a 30mm cannon on it, I guess Shakal's a pretty good one. Although if you get more value from it than you would from, say, a Striker Miquis, especially for its size, and I'm not sure about the cost, I don't know, I'm going to be convinced. But fundamentally, why do you really want a big wheeled IFV with a 30mm on it if you're already in the general vicinity of the expected war? Is it really that much cheaper than buying more Pumas and driving those? I don't know. Maybe I'm just missing something. Mike Quinton. Many modern tanks and IFVs have a lot of stuff on the top of the vehicle, such as a missile launcher, RWS, sensors, all of which run the risk of being shot off by the enemy or knocked off by a tree in a wooded area. Surely someone thought about this. What happened to low-profile vehicles being harder to hit? Trees, gunfire, 11'8" bridges. On the other hand though, you will have noticed in the AMP-V and the M10 Booker they have wire cutters now just by default installed in the vehicle, so I think they are starting to think about that a bit. However, the important parts of the vehicle are still harder to hit. Loss of the various appendages will be annoying and expensive, but not critical. Now obviously the systems themselves are armored as best they can be, but there's only so far that you can go before you become too heavy and you're basically talking about micro turrets on turrets. Ultimately, a lot of it simply comes down to being required to be outside the main form of the hull or turret in order to function. And the value of having the somewhat vulnerable system outside beats not having the system at all. Now, I suspect that as remote weapon stations become more used in a CIWS role against drones, they will proliferate even more, not less. As to the issue of visual signature, as thermals and other sensors continue to proliferate, the vehicle is harder to hide and the extra stuff matters less anyway. At best, the main vehicle can be hidden behind concealment while the RWS and optics appear up top. And those thermal sensors on the other end are proliferating down to the level that all the dismounts in my squadron are getting thermal imaging sights on their rifles. Given we need hemispheric protection now and observation these days, not just frontal arc, I don't think there's much option other than to continue having all these gadgets attached to the outside. Which brings us more or less onto Leon Peters Malone's question. With recent decisions to retain canister rounds for use against drones, investigations into APS used against drones, M134 used against drones, are we on the verge of seeing the drone UAS versus tank discussion flipping? The tank, or IFV, being seen as a drone killer rather than using a SHORAD or VSHORAD vehicle. It's something anything else vehicle can do. Longer term, do I see the outermost layers of the survivability onion being more emphasized, from field camouflage through to company or section level electronic warfare, a return to the fundamentals of fieldcraft? Unit profiles not only being measured in the visual spectrum but assessed in the full EM spectrum. Yes to almost all of that with a couple of caveats. I am not a fan of keeping canister around for use against drones. That is a tank cannon round being used to do something which other systems that aren't tanks can do. It's more of a short-term emergency backup. APS can very definitely work against drones. It's more a matter of tweaking the sensors and launchers, ensuring that they don't have coverage gaps, and also some additional programming. M134 is not going to be fielded against drones. That 1AD experiment with the M134 and the Lotus hatch was a local thing, not part of anything supported by PM Abrams. I'm not entirely sure what they were thinking about, and it never went anywhere. 7.62 is fine for drone killing, but a regular machine gun will do the job, i.e. 240 FN mag. This has been tested and is already in limited fielding. Remember my interview with Colonel Howell on M1E3. He stated that the RWS was up there to deal with drones. Now, what gets interesting is if the 7.62 is good for killing drones on an RWS, what does one do with the caliber 50? And on this, I'm going to reverse myself from a couple of years ago. Now, I had stated way back when that I felt the time of the big coaxes like on Leclerc was over, and that an RWS would give you all the advantages of having a fire control system without taking up space of the big gun inside the tank. But if the 7.62 is preferred for counter-drone work, if you want to keep the caliber 50, it's either going to be on a second RWS or it becomes a coax. Watch this space. However, I do not see tanks and IFVs becoming area air defense systems. Now, the APS and M240s are great point defense weapons, the last layer before the armor. They won't work well at more than 50 to 100 yards, but that's fine if one assumes that these smaller, faster drones aren't going to be picked up before 50 or 100 yards anyway. Specialized vehicles will still be needed, not least, in my opinion, because I still maintain that the biggest threat caused by drones isn't the attack drones, which have to get right up to the target, it's the observation drone, which flies a kilometer or 3 that way and reports movement for artillery or maneuver purposes. Very little mounted on a tank is going to see or engage that sort of a problem. So maybe looking at ADA systems like MADIS, MLADS, or Sergeant Stout. We may be looking at like interceptor drone version of a combat air patrol over the formation. Maybe it's F-16s with APK-AWS. It's the US Air Force. They can probably do that. But it's going to be something suited to task. But the ability to mount the point defense weapons, to my mind, is indeed one of the arguments that instead of being obsoleted by drones, mechanized formations have become even more important. You can slap an automated point defense system onto anything from a tank on the front line to the fuel truck 20 kilometers behind the line. It's kind of hard to slap a Königsberg protector onto a rifleman. Which means indeed that old school fieldcraft is coming back into vogue. I would refer you to my video going beyond the M, which I go into that sort of thing a tad more. The old Taj Mahals of large tents with lots of vehicles are a thing of the past. It's all about CP survivability and not looking like a CP. The official answer hasn't yet been determined and published yet, but we are all, and I include my own CP in this, running experiments to find the best compromise between smaller size and maintaining capability. Camo nets never really went away, but we are definitely all using them more. The E-tool, however, is definitely being dragged out of storage, subject to environmental rules where half the bases in the US won't allow you to actually dig a foxhole in the training area. Side note, although everybody calls them E-tools, the actual name is I-tool. The nomenclature system never changed from the old entrenching instead of entrenching. Either way, humans are still surviving on the battlefield in Ukraine, and the active defenses are the last thing that they're relying on. As to the EM spectrum question, that also has been a concern for some years. That famous NTC photo you may see on my channel before of a brigade's electromagnetic signature is now, what, a decade old? SOIs will, signal operating instructions, think of it as a standard operating procedure or template for signal communications. The SOIs will now likely include comms windows, heavier emphasis on burst transmissions, and as I understand it, the latest solution the US is trying is to simply accept the fact that a unit is going to have a detectable EM signature, and instead it has a mesh of so many transmitters constantly broadcasting and retransmitting everything that it's impossible to gain any useful intelligence out of it other than, well, there's a big unit over that away, but we probably already knew that. But you would be unable to identify specific types of units or locations. Little Z was binge watching videos on tanks and AT guns for the Battle of France in 1940 and noticed that a lot of the guns in service had about 40mm of penetration. The French 25, the Hotchkisses 37, the Panzer III's 3.7, even the short 7.5 on Panzer IV. If they all had the same penetration, wouldn't it make sense to simply default to the lowest caliber for increased stowage and rate of fire? Or do you go for a larger gun for upgradability? And he acknowledges, of course, that there are different guns for different roles, which is indeed the case particularly for the low velocity 7.5 on the Panzer IV, which definitely had a different role. But I think the rest are really more matters of coincidence. And yes, smaller is better if you're just looking for armor-piercing capability. It's why developing new ammunition was always preferred to using larger cannons. This going from APCR HVAP rounds of early World War II to the M829A4 of today, instead of going to a 130 or 140, or even just going to the longer gun of the L55. There is always resistance to upgunning unless it is deemed that the smaller gun simply can no longer do the job. But as for the difference between a British 2-pounder 40mm or a German 37mm, the 3mm makes bugger all difference really in capacity or rate of fire. And the actual choice between the one or the other is more down to national or institutional inertia. But bear in mind that unless you're British, other types of round are available. And the difference in HE payload between a high velocity 37mm and a 47mm is actually the significant difference between pathetic and poor. Unclear Whale was trying to figure out if the 1991 war was the impetus for the development of the M1070, which entered service in 1992, but he can't find anything much on the performance of M911. He has two questions. Firstly, how were M1s transported to their start points? Were they put in the back of trucks or did they self-move? And what was the 1070 development process? Was it a direct response to Gulf War lessons? To answer the first, almost all the tanks were transported to the jump-off points on trucks, and this actually represented something of a change in doctrine, as the normal thinking at the time was that they would simply drive themselves there, and that the transport trucks were more of a higher level transportation asset, and cue images of tanks on the Autobahn for Reforger, that sort of thing. However, the use of the transports was considered highly effective, and as such the doctrine changed a bit, with a massive increase in the purchase requirements for such trucks coming in 1992. There was also some financial incentive. Using $1990, it cost $180,000 per mile to move a full armoured brigade on its own tracks versus $15,000 per mile to move it on trucks. Thus, it was decided that the buy was going to increase from 1,072 HETS to 1,792. As for the replacement program, concerns over the M911 and M747 HETS combo were voiced by the early 1980s, as the M1 was obviously looking likely to exceed the 60-ton design requirement for the HETS. You think, oh my god, it's getting over 60 tons, we have to worry about our equipment. And now you look at the SEP V3, which is cracking 70 and even 80 if you put all the kit on it. Anyway, the question that they posed was, do we upgrade the current HETS or do we buy new ones? After testing through the first half of the 1980s, by 1986, The conclusion was we're going to replace it with the M1070 M1000 combo. The entry into service of this combination was not without trouble, which is why it took until the early 1990s for the system to enter mass production and service. And even at that, it still needed tweaking over the following years. Madouin was doing some napkin maths on the ratio in mechanized units between the number of vehicles, number of crew, and number of passengers, and noting the difference in cost and superfluous manual requirements between, say, a 6-passenger vehicle and an 8-passenger vehicle. After all, by adding just 2 more passengers, you get a, say, 25 to 30% reduction. It doesn't actually scale directly in cost of vehicle purchases, spares requirements, additional crew requirements, and so on. If it's a matter of firepower ratio supporting the troops, at what point does it become more meritorious to sacrifice the amount of vehicles in favor of fewer larger ones and use the crew manning and dollar values saved to man specific firepower providing vehicles like M10 Bookers or just tanks? It is certainly true that the troop capacity has gone down over the years.
Maybe you can leave one of the fellows behind. Put the ammo where the men go.
Sir, it is a troop carrier.
So? Make a couple extra trips. What's the difference?
I refer you to the really big boxer mentioned earlier, with room for 6 dismounts. It's got to have one of the lowest ratios of external volume to passenger capacity of any personnel transport vehicle out there. The exact balance of troops to armor support has been something which has been under constant change ever since the first mechanized formations were stood up. Initially, way too much armor for 2-for-U troops, but after that massive initial correction, we're definitely clawing back down the other way. Though the difference is now we're putting more and more firepower onto the troop carriers. Aforementioned Boxer with the 30mm in missiles, the XM30 to get a 50mm. In theory, if this keeps going, we could end up with a fleet of nothing but lots and lots of Merkavats, effectively IFVs with tank level armor and firepower, with space for 2 guys in the back. Now I get it, that's not what the space is there, Merkava is a tank, but you get my point. Eventually, I think you do still have to distinguish between a tank and an IFV, I think just for combat efficiency at a task. The idea of having a few transport vehicles with large capacity is one which I am sure the finance guys would love, but it comes with what I think are a very significant and fairly obvious snag. If one of your major transports hits a mine or gets blown up by a long-range missile, whatever, you just lost a platoon. Maybe only half of one in terms of manpower, but a half a platoon cannot be given a platoon's worth of combat tasks. How much do you want to rely on nothing happening to that one transport? Now, if you lose a 6-man group, it's most of a squad, but the platoon is still combat effective. The other design problem is simply that of internal volume. Shakal is Bradley levels of weight. Puma is over 40 tons. We no longer ask for just levels of protection against 23mm fire from the front or shell fragments from the side. We want serious armor on our vehicles. If you expand the size of the vehicle to fit just 2 more people, monsieur, even assuming the design can stretch with just an extra road wheel, think TLAV. Just how much weight are you throwing onto the vehicle with the additional armor required to add the additional volume? Now, there is one place where capacity does become important though, and that's when you're considering the lift of the vehicles themselves. The Marine Corps' AAAVs carried a score of men. The replacement, the ACV, carries a dozen, baker's dozen. Twice that of Bradley or the Schakal. But there's only so much well space on an amphibious ship, and it's not as if the troops are going to swim to shore if there aren't enough vehicles to get them all there. At least guys on foot can walk eventually. Felicity Longus. If the Korean War saw larger use of the T-34-85 and IS tanks, how might the UN forces have responded? New equipment? More the same. Probably not much different from what they actually did. They may have perhaps kept the Pershings around a little bit longer instead of leaving the Shermans to do the bulk of the work, but the Patton would have done fine. Especially with HVAP. And there was certainly nothing wrong with the Centurions that the British were sending, and doubtless there would have been more use of the Super Bazooka and the like. But the Korean War was in effect a come-as-you-are fight. The various vehicles of the next generation, even with the impetus of war and the tank panic, simply weren't completed quickly enough to be relevant. It's not that the UN forces didn't rush new equipment to the line as it was. Witness the 105mm M27 recoilless rifle, which didn't work fantastically well. But by the time it was remade into the 106mm M40, the war had been over for a couple of years. He also wants to know what the heck is the tank that was over my shoulder with the sandbags and damaged skirts. It looks like a T-95 but has return rollers. He has spent far too many hours trying to figure it out and has finally admitted defeat. World of Tanks players may recognize the T-95 FV4201 Chieftain hybrid. The backstory, which is real, is that the US and UK were kicking around the idea of swapping Chieftain and T-95 turrets and hulls with each other, or at least the guns. Tanks Encyclopedia does have an article on the various discussions and investigations, but the bottom line was that putting the Chieftain turret on T-95 was ridiculously difficult. Putting T-95 on Chieftain was more feasible, but still required work. But the Canadians wanted a different gun anyway, so what was the point? As for the model, it is, believe it or not, entirely 3D printed. It was sent into Wargaming as a production sample by some company that wanted to do a proposed business venture. The project evidently never went anywhere, and I grabbed the model because I was the most interested person in the office. And as 3D printed models go, it is absolutely excellent, and it must be done on a hell of an expensive printer considering the model is at least 10 years old, and it doesn't have any of that telltale layering that you might find on cheaper or older 3D printers, and the ink work is absolutely fantastic. Now, unless it was hand finished after the fact, sandpaper and airbrushes and all that, but I'm not sure that would have worked well for mass production, and I'm not convinced that's what happened. Either way, I have no idea the company that made it. Nugget. Canister rounds were very popular in the Pacific, but it was not developed for the larger guns on Sherman. Was it popular with other countries? Or just a very American way of doing things? The US always did like shotguns ever since their first infamous use in combat in World War I, to which the Germans objected. The reason canister was so commonly used in the Pacific versus elsewhere is that the Army decided the high explosive rounds were fine for the Sherman. The larger caliber guns had plenty of room for explosives and fragmentation effect, so no need for canister. After all, 37mm high explosive was more annoying than lethal. Now, as a 37mm gun hung around much longer in the Pacific, on M3 mediums and lights particularly, logically enough, they were used there more. Now, it wasn't just the Americans, of course, who developed canister. The British 20-pounder also came with canister, and it was the most popular round fired by Centurions in Vietnam. Now, you may have noticed in the back, I know a couple of you have actually commented, this tome by Bruce Cameron, Canister on Fire, which represents literally, it is the one-stop shop, absolutely everything down to the individual names of every crewman about the Royal Australian Armoured Corps in Vietnam. This is the one-stop shop. But the use of the word canister in the title implies just how much they liked it. Now, not necessarily for the lethal effect, but because it had a fantastic ability to strip away cover. So if, for example, one had an idea that there was a bunker in that general vicinity, fire a canister round in that general direction, all the cover would be stripped away and you could now easily see and directly engage that bunker. But of course, if you happen to encounter troops exposed, Ken did a good job on them also. Most countries, however, decided to move to timed or later programmable high explosive fuses if they weren't using American-issued canister or beehive in their patents. So it does seem to be generally an Americanism. Captain Tanker Joe, with the adoption of the XM7. If you haven't gathered, I'm reading this off a teleprompter. How long before there is an upgrade such as M16 went to A4? And that shows you how long it's been since the last Q&A, since the Army has already announced that it's going to go with the shorter M7A1. I'm not convinced, but neither am I a small arms expert. Incidentally, I know I have a viewer here who does know a lot more about the M7 than most internet pundits due to his work. He has told me that Ian is correct that it may not be the best system, but wrong as to the reasoning. But I will leave the further details to him if he wishes to chime in. John Cryer, what's the current status of Armor Branch? Yeah, I gotta answer this one carefully. Will the snail's pace of XM30 kill the program? KNDS has already started delivering Leopard 2 A8s. What chance M1A3 actually enters wide service? Okay. Armor Branch are certainly not in the ascendancy, that's for sure, with the gutting of the armor fleet by, 5 brigades. I was told recently, and I believe it, that there are more 3-stars in the army who came out of SF or SOF than out of armor and artillery combined. So much for the combat armor decision and the king of battle. And that's before one gets to the argument, with the pivot to the Pacific, you don't need tanks. Well, let's have a look at a Pacific country with its 17,500 islands and its 50% jungle and see what they think. Now, to be fair, it's not entirely doom and gloom for Armor Branch. The armoured brigades which are being kept do have a bright future, and I expect that the resultant armoured divisions will be far and away more capable than any other equivalent size formation, for the few countries which actually can field equivalent size formations. I suspect the number of countries capable of fielding complete modern armoured divisions is probably less than the number of fingers I have. I think the chances of XM30 being produced are actually quite reasonable, especially since the goals have been a bit reduced. Now, there was an interesting discussion on my Discord recently about mission creep. The US Army actually seems to do the reverse. They tend to initially shoot for the moon, but as reality hits them, they reduce the desired capabilities. With XM30 a case in point, it started out life as the optionally manned fighting vehicle before they realized just, okay, you can't do it, technology just isn't there yet, and it became the minimally manned fighting vehicle. I mentioned how Booker reduced its requirements to become more reasonable as well in the other video. Now, if you compare this with, say, our Navy colleagues and their attempts to build frigates, which I presume by definition are not supposed to be as capable as destroyers, but they seem to keep trying to make frigates almost as capable as the destroyers. Comparing XM30 or M1E3 to Leo 2A8 isn't exactly fair. Leo 2A8 is more of an interim vehicle pending the next generation MGCS, assuming that continues. The XM30 and M1E3 are entirely new generations of vehicles, and I would argue the first truly new generation since the 1930s. Indeed, I would agree with others who say that the biggest threat to M1E3 is that current tankers are too conservative to take full advantage of the possibilities the vehicle provides. Fortunately, most of the technology and the backbone from XM30 also applies to M1E3 and vice versa, so if the one makes it, the other should as well. The engineering itself is relatively easy, Ajax notwithstanding. Either way, I don't think the Army has a choice. M1A2 is just too damn heavy, and so the new form factor is necessary. If they can sort out the software which makes it all work well, and I think they can, then great. Otherwise you end up with a TTB. Interesting, but still way behind the technological power curve, and you are still going to be reliant on a lot of upgrades to the internal workings to keep the tank viable in the 2040s and 2050s. As for cavalry, well, we know most of the Cav squadrons have gone away. This was primarily a manning problem with the need for the 19 series to man Bookers and infantry Bradleys, since infantry apparently don't want to do it anymore. With the Bookers no longer taking up the manpower requirements, there hasn't been a massive push for the remaining IBCT Cav squadrons, mainly but not exclusively Guard, to go away. There are also arguments over whether or not the multifunction recon companies are a good replacement. Apparently infantry do want to do recon. I have my own opinions, biased as I am. However, I suspect few people, and I'm not one of them, are expecting Cav squadrons to return to the brigades. But there is at least some rumblings about returning division cavalry, especially since division commanders no longer are able to commandeer a brigade Cav squadron to do the job, and so have no Div Cav capability anymore. There is also a new cavalry manual coming out. At this time of recording, the replacement for ATP 3-20.96, last refined in 2016, has not yet come out, but the public gist of it is that the new doctrine, and I quote the Chief of Armour here, Instead of focusing on what the cavalry squadron does, reconnaissance and security, reoriented on what the cavalry does for the main body, inform, protect and fight. Again, I have not read it, it has not yet been published, so quite what that means in practical terms, I'm not sure. I'm kind of getting the feeling it's supposed to be a little bit more aggressive than the current version of the manual, but I've always been a rather aggressively oriented cav guy anyway, so I may not be perhaps the correct target audience. I do note with some caution, however, that the new manual was apparently written with input from ABCT Cav squadron commanders, but not striker or infantry. Yes, we're still out there. Anyway, grab a copy of the Spring 2026 Armour magazine for what more is available publicly. Behinkle 530 has a question about the MGM-51 Shillelagh. My dad used to work with a guy who commanded a Sheridan during Vietnam, and one story he told was coming across a manual for a Shillelagh marked Special, which required the tank to be at maximum range, facing away from the target with the gun to the rear. After firing, drive away at top speed. Is there any truth to this, or just a tall tale? I find the idea of a 6-inch nuclear warhead to be unlikely. If such a special missile variant were to exist, I would suggest it would be a chemical warhead. Apparently firing chemicals from artillery rounds can be a bit tricky, and a slower, big, heavy missile might be able to do a better job with more precision. However, I can find no indication of even a proposal of such a warhead, so until any further evidence comes to light, I'm going to list it under tall tale. Wookie Davidson, did I get anything cool for Christmas? Probably. I can't remember what it might have been. It wasn't model related anyway. I did buy myself a new pistol, which I'll be using at Finnish Brutality. Black Birds. Why did the Army elect to procure KVs in the form of the unarmoured variant? Now, I suspect two reasons. The first being cost. If the Arctic brigades are the equivalent to IBCTs/MBCTs, when the KV is closer to an ISV than an armoured car, just a way of getting to the fight faster, it makes sense. Notwithstanding that they're actually now looking at armoured ISVs, but that's another long discussion. Cockvs? Well, Cockvs weren't armoured, but still, they looked the part. The second is that one of the requirements was that they had to be able to sling load the thing, especially if it's loaded with cargo. Armoured variants can exceed the sling lift limit even without anything inside them. I don't have any information on the Canadian use of lavs in the Arctic. To answer your second question, maybe someone else can chime in to find out how they work up in deep snow and incredible cold. Also, given the M1E3 can fit a coffee maker, he notes that there are now practical devices to harvest water from the atmosphere. Would I like one on the tank? Well, the article says it comes with its own solar panel too, so it's a matter of ruggedness and space. If a unit can produce its own water literally out of thin air, there are serious savings to be found in logistics. I would be very surprised if the Army isn't going to look very hard at this. They may also be able to disband some of the water purification units and use the money and manpower elsewhere. Now, it's not a new idea. DARPA has been looking at it for over 20 years, and I suspect they may have gotten the idea in the 1970s. The Army's first testing at Aberdeen was happening by 2008 in conjunction with the Office of Naval Research. The Army at the time had requirements for both truck and man-pack systems. Now, as time progressed and things developed, by about 5 years ago, they were getting 15 to 35 litres of water from a big machine that used 2.5 gallons of JP8. But again, this took time, it took equipment. Last year, a prototype compact water harvester, so what is officially being called, for the Army was publicly released. The thing comes in at about 55 pounds and is about 2 foot by 1. However, as it doesn't even produce 4 litres a day, it's not surprising it hasn't been fielded, and it is still a test and development item. Now, this new ultrasonic device that you link to is supposedly 45 times more efficient and uses less power, at which point this becomes seriously viable. But again, though, it also comes down to volume and ruggedness. Can the thing fit and operate on a moving tank? Can it even survive on a moving tank to operate when it's sitting still? And that may determine the level at which such devices may be found. Moisture evaporators could well end up being a battalion level thing, or perhaps found in fixed positions like fortifications. Also, have I considered playing Nebulous Fleet Command? Never heard of it. Which brand of boot wins over the most tankers? Honestly, I'm not sure. I think mine are Belleville's, but mainly because it was what was in the PX. There is a Korean company called Boomoo, which apparently gets very good reviews, if perhaps a bit inconvenient to get at. And Carolina Shoe Company has a few, but I don't know anybody who has one, but I don't exactly go around asking. The best boots I've had were my original issue of black boots that I got back in 2002, steel toes and a lining. Unfortunately, I have absolutely no clue the manufacturer. Con of class. There were versions of the Vickers Mark I and Mark III with swing-fire ATGMs mounted on the sides of the turret. Have there been any other main battle tanks to go with non-gun launched ATGMs as a secondary armament? In theory, I guess you got something like Perch or Brimstone, or you could stick a javelin on a Crows, but no, I can't think of any which entered service in the same way as lighter vehicles such as the AMX-13 did. I mean, what's the point? Bernard, over on Military History Visualized, has sent me a translation of a manual for the training, employment and command of the assault gun battery. It's a manual published mid to late 1942. So he's selling these. Go check out the link if you want one. It's always a good idea to look at the primary source if you can. Human translations tend to pick up on nuance better than using the Google Translate function on your phone. Simple, long, right. Anyway, there's a link down below if you're curious about it. I have absolutely no idea what other manuals he's looking at. Anyway, C. McKay. Given that the earliest British tank guns were repurposed ship guns, are there other examples of tanks and ships sharing guns? I'd have thought that direct fire weapons on both might share certain characteristics and requirements. Well, it's certainly possible to cheat. Just stick a tank turret on the ship or an artillery turret. Or at least take the tank gun and a naval mount, or a naval gun and a tank mount. The problem with tank turrets on ships tends to be more that they are a tad heavy for what you get out of it, often with limited range of elevation, especially if you consider the ship guns also have an anti-air roll. And the problem with ship turrets on tanks is that ship turrets tend to be massive deck penetrating installations with volume requirements for ammunition handling below decks. Now, you saw the D10 100mm a couple of times in those photos, and that started out as an S-34 naval gun. However, the most common source for a tank gun is usually anti-aircraft work. Think 7.5 Swedish, 85 Soviet, 8.8 German, 3-inch or 90mm American. For those, volume and weight were usually more important criteria. Not that these aren't important criteria for a ship, but ships don't have to worry about things like railroad loading gauges and turret ring size limitations. Falling steel. Tank engines are always compared with horsepower. Why aren't torque values brought up? Well, they are, at least by people who know what they're talking about. There is a reason why the turbine has survived so long in the M1, and that only with the capabilities of torque coming from the electric motor of the new hybrid diesel electrics has the US Army considered, or actually is, moving to an alternative. Interestingly, I also note the Cadillac just announced that they're no longer putting torque numbers on the backs of their cars. Apparently Americans don't understand what Newton meters are or what they do for you. Joshua Bristow. I remember that famous Chieftain quote, "There will be no submarines." Under what circumstances had you the confidence to say that, and what happened after that which ultimately led to submarines being added to the game? Now, backstory, we got to go back over a decade to World of Warships and a video that I did even before it was released, when I said exactly that, there will be no submarines in the game. Well, I said it because I was told in explicit terms by the game developers to say it as part of the PR process. Now, I presume that was their intent and belief at the time. As to what happened to change that, I guess the developers changed their minds. I had recorded more humorous retraction videos than the one which was eventually released, but the PR folks apparently didn't like them. And on that note, I've run out of questions. As I say, it's been a while, and it'll be a while probably for the next one. As I say, Squadron Command has taken up a lot of my time. They like to keep you in charge for about 2 years, and I'm 6 months shy, so I wouldn't be surprised to find my marching orders coming soon. Which I'm going to miss it. I like Troop Command. I really am liking Squadron Command as well. But isn't that the way of things? We'll see. Wherever I go, it's not going to be as much fun. Retirement may be starting to look better. At least that way you can stop running. Let's see, where else am I going? So as I said, we have Waves Fest. I might bounce around the UK a little bit. Oz Armour. I'm going to Brisbane. The way the flights are, I might as well just, it's easy for me to spend an extra day and just check out Brisbane. There's so many parts of Australia I want to go to I haven't been to yet. In fact, there's so many parts of the world. I'm 51 years old and I'm realizing I'm not going to get to all the places I want to get to. I will be doing some filming in Finland at Parola because, I'm there and make the most of it. Let's see, I've got some German stuff yet to come out, some American stuff yet to come out. Some from the last trip to the UK hasn't come out. Again, this is all a matter of time that I don't have available. Let's see, t-shirts, as I said at the beginning, going on sale, and yeah, that's pretty much it. If you can help me out with liking, subscribing, or better yet, help me out with the Patreon to help me fund all this, I would greatly appreciate it. So until then, hope you found it all interesting and informative. Oh yeah, there might be grease as well. Take care. I'll talk to you on the next one.